Topics in the History of Mathematics, MA 290, Cassette 3, Side 2. Mathematical Practice and Society in Stuart, England. A talk by Dr. Simon Schaffer of the Department for the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. You should listen to this at the end of Unit 6. The cassette develops further the theme which emerges in the final section of Unit 6 on the world of mathematical practitioners and their instruments.
The true way of art is not by instruments, but by demonstration. The use of instruments is indeed excellent if a man be an artist, but contemptible being opposed to art.
For no one to know the use of a mathematical instrument except he knows the cause of its operation is somewhat too strict, which would keep many from affecting the art, because they see nothing but obscure propositions and perplexed and intricate demonstrations before their eyes.
To play with instruments as a child doth with babies, or a juggler with trinkets, is unworthy of a divine, yea, of a rational man, and worthy only of some rude and reasonless dullman.
To which vilification I answer, that instrumental operation is not only the compendiating and facilitating of art, but even the glory of it.
Opposing views about the use of mathematical instruments and the type of people who concern themselves with them. Yet both speakers are themselves mathematicians who have earned money from the invention of instruments. In fact, they were once master and pupil. The harsh opening words against the use of instruments come from William Outred. He is an elderly Surrey clergyman of private means and a graduate of King's College, Cambridge. His opponent, Richard Delamain, had worked as a joiner and a writing master. He then began to earn a good living selling mathematical instruments to the wealthy. The row takes place in London in the 1630s, a London in which mathematics is taking on a commercial face. It's about the invention of one particular mathematical instrument, the circles of proportion. This was a logarithmic calculating device, a forerunner of the slide rule. It consisted of two circles of different sizes, each marked with a logarithmic scale, joined at the centre so that they could rotate. You could easily multiply with these by adding a length marked on the scale of one circle to another length marked on the scale of the other circle. So they worked on the same sort of principle as the sector designed by Edmund Gunter, but were easier to use as they didn't require compasses. Delamain claimed that he'd invented this instrument first. Outred's story is that he himself had invented it many years before, but hadn't bothered to publish details of it. The dispute is interesting, not just as a personal quarrel between two notable figures. It can also shed light on the place of mathematics in 17th century society. Outred is one of the outstanding English mathematicians of this period. His book, The Clavis Mathematicae, or Key to Mathematics, was an important work which helped to spread the idea of working in algebraic symbols. For example, it was one of the 5 mathematical books that Isaac Newton was to study as a Cambridge undergraduate 30 years later. Moreover, Outred was a very influential teacher. He gave free tuition to the many students who wanted to learn from him. In fact, his biographer, John Aubrey, tells us that he would sometimes give them a good dinner as well. One of Outred's pupils, Seth Ward, even lived with him for 6 months, and Outred refused to accept any payment for his food. Many of his pupils went on to become famous mathematicians. Among them were John Wallis and Christopher Wren. Delamain is a rather less noteworthy figure, but despite his rather humble beginnings as a joiner, he did become wealthy and successful in his own day as a result of the sales of his mathematical instruments and handbooks. However, the important thing is not which of these men is the better mathematician, or which of them is the true inventor of the circles of proportion. The story of their rivalry is a useful way to enter into the atmosphere of the mathematical community of their day and to study the changing relationship between mathematics and society. It's necessary to look briefly at the events of the dispute, but we must go beyond the facts to the motivation and values of the characters involved. The sort of things we'll find them saying about each other and about their skills will help us to understand the conflicting attitudes which existed in their day about the right way to learn mathematics and the duty of mathematicians. Outred and Delamain's priority dispute wasn't the first quarrel of this kind. Outred himself had previously got involved in another dispute with the Gresham astronomy professor Edmund Gunter over who'd been the first to invent another mathematical device, which Outred called his horizontal instrument. After Gunter and Outred had discussed their various inventions at Gresham College, Gunter published details of Outred's instrument without giving him the credit. He had the information then sold at the shop of a master instrument maker. Outred was furious. Yet what happened to him happened to many of the mathematicians who designed instruments, and the dispute between him and Gunter was typical of the conflicts which were to arise in the heated commercial atmosphere of the instrument shops of London. Outred was discovering that others could make money out of his ideas, a galling prospect, and this was what happened when Delamain published an account of the circular logarithmic rule. Outred thought that since he had invented the instrument, he should have control over the rights of its sale. So he eventually decided to let his work on the logarithmic rule be printed. The sales of his instrument and the accompanying textbook were to benefit the instrument maker Elias Allen and Outred's own pupil, William Forster, who was to translate his works from Latin. For it was not just instruments, but knowledge about how to use them that was valuable. Delamain said he'd got the model for his circular slide rule from reading Gunter's book on the sector and from going to Gunter's lectures at Gresham College. Gunter had marked a rule with a logarithmic scale so that it was possible to multiply two numbers by adding lengths using a pair of compasses. But in February 1629, Delamain realized that this cumbersome method could be improved upon if, instead of having to move the compasses, you could move the scale itself. It was in the following year, 1630, that Delamain published his first account of such a device. His Grammelogia described a circular slide rule, that is, a device for multiplying numbers which is done by rotating circles marked with scales. So, according to Delamain, this instrument was his own development of Gunter's work. But Outred and his disciple, Forster, saw events in a very different light. Outred said that he himself had discussed the sector and the logarithmic line with Gunter before 1620. He was incensed that his old rival Gunter had, through Delamain, got the credit for having invented these instruments first. An account of Outred's own linear slide rule and another portable instrument was then published by Forster. He claimed Delamain had copied both of these and included a detailed account of Delamain's alleged crimes. Delamain, Outred, and Forster all wrote accounts of the meetings between Outred and Delamain before the publication of Delamain's book. Forster describes a meeting at Outred's house in the summer of 1630 in which they discussed Gunter's rule.
Being in the time of the long vacation, 1630, in the country, at the house of the Reverend and my most worthy friend and teacher, Mr. William Outred, I told him of a rule of numbers, sines, and tangents, such as is normally called Mr. Gunter's ruler, which one had bespoken to be made, 6 feet long, to be used with a pair of beam compasses.
Outred is critical of the Gunter ruler.
This is a poor invention, Mr. Forster, and a performance very troublesome. But seeing you are taken with such mechanical ways of instruments, I will show you what devices I have had by me these many years. And first, he brought to me 2 rulers of that sort, to be used by applying one to the other, without any compasses, and after that he showed me those lines cast into a circle or ring, with another movable circle upon it. I wonder, good sir, that you could so many years conceal such useful inventions, not only from the world, but from myself, to whom in the past you have been so liberal. The true way of art is not by instruments, but by demonstration. It is a preposterous course of vulgar teachers to begin with instruments and not with the sciences, and so, instead of artists, to make their scholars only doers of tricks and, as it were, jugglers, to the despite of art, loss of precious time and betraying of willing and industrious wits into ignorance and idleness.
So, according to Forster, Oughtred had invented a circular slide rule some years before 1630, but hadn't published it, because he thought it essential that people should understand the basic mathematical principles of logarithms first, and only then should they use the instruments. But Forster continues.
He also showed me many notes and rules for the use of those circles and of his horizontal instrument, which he had projected about 30 years before, the most part written in Latin. All which I obtained of him leave to translate into English and make public for the use and benefit of such as were studious and lovers of these excellent sciences.
Forster's brief account of Oughtred's inventions appeared at the same time as Delamain's work. Could it be that Delamain had got his idea from Oughtred? When the two men met in a London street in November 1630, Oughtred claimed that Delamain had all but confessed his own mathematical ignorance. But Delamain says that during the meeting, Oughtred talked about the straight version of the instrument and denied he could have learnt anything new from the older man.
He did not mention its circular form, so straight away I sent him a copy of my own circular rule, which was known to me long before that time.
Like Forster, Delamain says he was surprised that Oughtred could have made such an improvement on the instrument and yet kept it to himself. So, in summary, Delamain says he hadn't got the idea of the circular rule from Oughtred. It had been his own development of Gunter's straight rule. But Oughtred and Forster both thought Delamain had copied this circular rule from Oughtred. They also thought that before Delamain, other instrument makers had already distributed manuscript descriptions of various slide rules by 1631. So what conclusion can we come to about who really invented the circular slide rule? It seems that Oughtred, in collaboration with Gunter, was the invention of the principle of the slide rule as a scale along a cursor or line. Soon after this, instrument makers like Elias Allen, Richard Delamain, and Thomas Brown began to manufacture variants of the original. In a competitive market, it was in the interests of makers to design their instruments to look as different and novel as possible. But Delamain could nevertheless claim priority in developing, or rather publishing, the circular form of the rule. But in this story, we're not just concerned with who had priority. What's more interesting is the sort of things they said in their arguments about mathematical practice and teaching, and what this tells us about Stuart's society. Remember that in the closely knit community of London, mathematicians were constantly arguing, and through these arguments, which we can follow in their original writings, we can learn a lot about their attitudes and the role of mathematics in society. Delamain emphasized that mathematical arts could be performed by the lowly.
Joiners, carpenters and other mechanics about this town and elsewhere, yea, schoolboys, can make instruments.
To Oughtred, who valued theoretical understanding, Delamain's practical approach was unsatisfactory. Yet Delamain asserted that he did not need the kind of theory used in Gunter's book. Oughtred was interested in the status of the mathematician, and in where Delamain got his mathematical learning. He was not impressed with his former pupil.
What university, what degree, what court of faculties, what other lawful way conferred it upon you?
Delamain was not considered a true scholar. In particular, he's criticised for not being able to read Latin, which was considered an essential skill. A real point of contention between Delamain and Oughtred was the status that mathematical practitioners were to have. It may look as if it's a simple conflict between the gentleman scholar, Oughtred, and the artisan, Delamain, but it's more complicated than that. Delamain was, after all, highly successful. He had dedicated Grammologia to the king, Charles I, From 1663, he was employed by the king at £40 a year as a professional mathematician, and after 1636 surveyed forts with the Master of the Ordnance and educated the Prince of Wales with instruments and techniques. There is even a suggestion that the silver dial, which Charles I carried to the scaffold in 1649, was made for him by Delamain. Indeed, Delamain's widow successfully petitioned Parliament for a pension after 1645. Delamain's success must have added fuel to the struggle. And then Oughtred himself didn't entirely despise the practical dimension of his work. He had told Forster that it was his distaste for instruments that made him reluctant to publish details of his slide rule, and yet in fact he sometimes did work which was very practical. An example of this is that in 1633, after the Delamain-Oughtred argument, the Vintners Company asked Oughtred, along with Allen, to produce a new method of gauging wine barrels. He undertook to do this. Oughtred criticised the earlier texts on gauging by Gunter and Briggs, which had used logarithms. He himself applied his slide rule to the new artificial gauging line, and it was very successful. So the Delamain-Oughtred dispute was not between practice on the one hand and purity on the other, but about how to integrate the two. Oughtred may have felt that the commercial face of London mathematics was necessary and engaged in commerce from time to time himself, but he didn't like this aspect of contemporary mathematical life.
The instruments I do not value or weigh one single penny. If I had been ambitious of praise, or had thought them worthy at which to have taken my rise out of my secure and quiet obscurity, to mount up into glory and the knowledge of men, I could have done it many years before this pretender knew anything at all in these faculties.
Delamain couldn't understand this attitude.
Our author, Oughtred, may answer for himself. He reporteth now that he had the invention for more than 12 years past, but not put it to use, which in a sense was injurious both to God and man, if he saw the copious and compendious use of it then, as now he doth. If God bestows his talents on us, we ought to communicate them to others.
A religious responsibility to communicate mathematical discoveries. But the problem was that this involved status and money as well. Oughtred attacked Delamain because he believed he'd bought success in society at too high a price by bringing mathematics into disrepute. To appreciate this, we must look briefly at the growing importance of mathematics in late 16th century and 17th century society. It was becoming more and more clear that some skill in mathematics was essential for English gentlemen if they were to carry out an occupation in the navy or in trade, to manage their own estates, to work in administration or in government. Mathematics was also used to entertain noble patrons with elegant and instructive displays. Stage machinery was a very visible application of mathematical principles. While Delamain worked for the royal court, Oughtred taught in London at the house of the wealthy and artistic Earl of Arundel. Instruments were, of course, the easiest way to help such gentlemen understand the practice of mathematics. But what they needed to know was not how to construct them, only how to use them from a simple set of rules. A whole new trade arose to meet this demand by producing instruments and training gentlemen to use them. Many mathematicians undertook this. But not everyone who took up this new profession was reputable, and a bad teacher could waste time and money. This new social development is what lies behind Oughtred's criticism of Delamain. Oughtred regarded making instruments and teaching people to use them as inferior occupations. Anyone who understood the mechanical principles involved could do this. He accused Delamain of being like those to whom
nothing can savour that is learned and analytical, but only the superficial scum and froth of instrumental tricks and practices.
Practitioners like this bring the mathematical profession into disrepute. Oughtred writes that Delamain's instruments were designed for his ambition and vain glory. They were made of silver and gold, although brass would have been adequate. There was no real need for Delamain's mathematical ring to be 6 feet large. The instruments which Delamain's noble clients bought were needlessly elegant, sizable, and costly.
In far shorter time, and with much less labour, you may be taught with a book of 12 pence to work and perform far more and more exactly than by that monstrous barrel Delamain himself can ever be able to effect.
So these are two elements in the dispute: the reputation of mathematicians and the relationship of instrument makers with those who relied on them. Another thing in which Delamain and Oughtred differ is in their attitude towards teaching mathematics. Delamain argued that you could teach the pupils to use instruments right from the start, even if they didn't understand the reasoning behind them. Gentlemen don't want to learn very much mathematics, they only want as much as they need to carry out their work. As Delamain says,
they would make but a step into that kind of learning whose only desire is expedition and facility.
It's best to do this with instruments because
it is easier for a man to learn more useful practice upon instruments in 1 hour's instruction than to know the cause in 20 hours of some instrumental operation.
So expediency is the key. Delamain also thinks that by starting with instruments, you can teach their practical use and principles of mathematics at the same time. Oughtred disagrees with this. He emphasizes the need for rigorous thinking in mathematics. It was not enough to know just how to use an instrument. So in this Oughtred-Delamain debate, we found a number of differences in attitude to the use of mathematics for instrument making. We find differing views of the sort of people who made their living from instruments. We find conflict over the status such people could obtain through this new profession. Both men disagree radically about teaching methods, about whether one must have a thorough theoretical grounding before attaining practical skills. So it is more than a personal quarrel between an elderly mathematician and his former pupil. It is about the very nature of mathematical knowledge and the way it should be treated in the society of the time. We must remember that in 1630 this application of mathematics was new and potentially subversive. Within 10 years, the Civil War was to break out. The uncertainty about the status of mathematics that we see in this debate reflects a growing instability of English society. This crisis included a violent attack on established forms of learning. The universities were eventually purged and radical new kinds of knowledge developed. During these battles, the division between traditional scholarship and the skill of craftsmen and mechanics was often contested. So the issues Oughtred and Delamain discussed came to acquire vital political meaning. No longer could mathematics remain pure knowledge for its own sake. These developments meant that it was now inextricably linked with society, socially valuable and potentially dangerous at the same time.